Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today I have a watch review, and it's a review of a piece which I've been looking forward to showing, because this is a brand which has been featured on a great deal of different press websites of watches, but it's a brand which offers something very different from Belgium. And the brand's name is Méraud, and they're a brand which is relatively young in terms of pieces being released, as this watch is currently on Kickstarter. And the watch itself is of course being sold for a reduced price as a result of the Kickstarter deals, but I feel even when it's being sold for its full price, it offers a great deal in terms of value and also in terms of details and quality at a very impressive price with a very interesting movement. Now before I speak about the watch itself, and indeed I have three variants here, all three variants of the watch in fact, in order to demonstrate the different colours and the different strap options. But I'd like to speak about the packaging first. And as you can see, this is the box the watch comes in, which has this soft touch finish in black, and is branded with the Méraud logo. And I will point out that the name of this is quite interesting in terms of its origins, and so I'll talk you through that once I have the watch out of the box, whilst also talking about the origin of the name of the watch itself. But suffice to say that the box is very well made, and very sturdy, with a push-button release, which, as you can see, presses in order to then release the top of the box. And once open, one's presented, of course, with the timepiece, but I'll step aside and not look at this immediately, because the box itself is quite interesting to look at, and the features which it has. Of course, it's very nicely fitted with these hinges, which allow the box to simply sit open, which is something I wouldn't expect to see at this price range with this sort of finishing. But also one has a rather attractive patterning to the surface of the inside of the box. And if I just take the watch out for a moment, I would like to demonstrate what else there is provided inside the box. Because aside from having the embossed Méraud logo up at the top here, which you may be able to see, if one removes this section, one sees a variety of interesting elements which are seen with the watch. Now I will point out that none of these pieces, such as for instance this NATO, are indeed in their final form, and as you can see this is missing some of the hardware, which will be customised. But this I think is a good demonstration of what the brand is going for in terms of the quality of their straps, because as you can see the strap itself has this very fine seatbelt weave, as opposed to the more coarse grain of weave one would expect to see from a NATO strap. It's also quite a light strap, and in many ways mimics the Omega straps one sees very, very well, in terms of having these rather fine holes and these sealed sides which are woven in as opposed to simply being cut, which creates a real sense of quality, which I will look forward to seeing when this is finished. One's also provided with a tropical style of strap, and bearing in mind the naming of this watch and the fact that it's designed to follow on from the 1960s and dive watches from that period, I think this strap is a very good choice. As you can see, it's perforated through its top to allow the wrist to breathe, and this isn't in its final version, but rather will see further developments, but even so I think this gives a very good demonstration of what they're aiming for. And there's, as you can see, is a single keeper, and the buckle itself is rather interestingly detailed. Now the buckle itself does follow a design which I think ties in with the watch itself very, very well, because one sees this branding which is very deeply engraved, with a style of bead blasting underneath it to really help with the differentiation of the logo with the rest of the buckle itself. And I think it's details like this which really help to demonstrate the care with which a watch has been produced, and I think there is undoubtedly great care with this watch. And the last thing in the box is this, and this is the tool that you're provided with upon receiving the watch, and as you can see it's not the easiest thing to get out on camera, but if I just pop that out like so, one sees, I think, again a demonstration of the care taken, because it's a very elegant solution to needing a tool for your watches, because as you can see this lid comes off, and then one simply removes, by dropping the tool itself out, one puts it back into its position, and then places it through here, which allows one to have a tool. And I think this design, this concept of having everything integrated into a single item you can travel with, is a really interesting one, something I really wouldn't expect to see at this price range, which I think says a great deal about the brand. But without any further ado, I'll now talk about the watches, the straps, and the general details of these rather interesting 1960s-inspired dive watches. And so here you can see all three versions available of this watch. But before I speak about these watches directly, I would like to issue my normal statement that I'm not being paid in any way to produce this video, or to produce a positive review, because I feel this would greatly reduce the integrity of the channel, but also the quality of the reviews themselves, which I think is extremely important for you, my viewers. And so without any further ado, these are the three versions, with the graphite grey on the left, this onyx black, and then the marine blue. And these three watches make up a rather interesting range of possibly the most conservative of the three, two far more exotic forms, if you will, but all three have their rather interesting and rather delicate characteristics. Now I'll pick up the Onyx Black version just to demonstrate the case itself, because as you can see the case is both brushed and polished, but the dimensions are 39mm from side to side, with the bezel overhanging that ever so slightly. One then also has a 48.5mm lug-to-lug length, with these curved lugs which arc down towards the wrist, and a 12.5mm thickness. One also has a 20mm lug span, and the watch itself is, as you can see, mostly dial on the front, whilst the bezel is rather narrow and slim around the sides. And the design of the case is a very interesting form, because from the top you can see it appears smaller than it actually is, through the use of these polished bevels which run around the very edge of the case and cut out this very sharp line that would otherwise be present on the side of the lug. This also means one has a curve to the end of the lug themselves, and also allows the lugs to appear quite narrow and slender by comparison to a more modern style of dive watch. However, the strength of these lugs still appears very significant as a result of their height, and so visually they don't appear too small for the watch itself, because they are given this depth. And as you can see, they are also drilled. And the purpose of this is that one can change straps much more easily, rather than having to fight around with a spring bar tool underneath the lug. One can simply press the spring bar out through the hole, which is a convenient touch and something seen on a lot of watches nowadays, but I think far less than one would hope, because it is a very helpful feature to have. One also has a bezel which, as you can see, sits flush with the case itself, but does add a certain amount of thickness, though I'll speak about the bezel itself later on in the video when speaking about the dials and the colours available. But as you can see, the finishing of the case is very fine. The quality of the brushing is extremely good, especially bearing in mind the price of these watches. And I feel at this stage I should state that the price for these watches, or at least will be after the pre-order period, will be €849, which I think is a reasonable price bearing in mind the specifications this watch is offering. On the front of the watch you'll notice that it has this domed sapphire crystal, and this sits flush with the case itself, and I think helps the whole front of the watch to take on a certain profile, as opposed to having certain elements protruding more or less. And so they could have gone for a very heavily domed box crystal, but they've chosen to go for something a bit more delicate, and I think bearing in mind the dome that the bezel has, this was a good choice. And the crystal itself features an internal anti-reflective coating, which means that you have really the best of both worlds, in terms of having the scratch resistance of sapphire without having a soft anti-reflective coating on the surface to get scratched, but one also has a certain amount of anti-reflective treatment, which means that even at these angles with bright light, one can normally read the watch without any difficulty. And of course the beauty of a domed crystal also means that one can read it at these extreme angles rather than it simply becoming a mirror, which is a helpful feature especially for a dive watch of this type. And these are 200-metre dive watches, and I think serve that sort of function very well, though it should be admitted that they do follow a more dressy line than many other sort of more professional dive watches. And this is perhaps most obviously seen in the hands and dial, because it follows a 50s or 60s style of design and doesn't move into the very modern style of dive watch with large luminous hands and a fully graduated bezel. Instead, this follows the sort of line of a watch which might have been worn by a diver in the 1950s or 60s, and so one sees a dial with a 12 o'clock numeral, which, as you can see, is metal rimmed with this applied metal section which is applied to the surface of the dial. This also matches the luminous indices around the rest of the dial with these circles every hour and a triangle at every quadrant. Now, interestingly, these are smaller than one might expect, and I feel this also plays out to make the dial appear larger on a watch which I would originally have assumed to be 42mm, but having actually measured it, it was 39. And so I think the size of the dial is quite deceptive by making the watch feel small as a result of a small case, but still having that additional size provided by the design of the dial. One also has hands which are similarly in that line of having something a bit more delicate, because they're these pencil hands with tips that protrude in polished metal. These are also filled with luminova, depending upon the version, with C3 being used, as well as some aged style of radium lume. And of course one has a second hand with that characteristic tip, which isn't a circle or a lollipop, but instead follows this form of a sort of a crystal-shaped pointer, which I think is a nice touch, and with that flared-out counterweight to the second hand, it's an extremely classically correct look. Now if I flip the case to the side, one sees the crown, and the crown is a screw-down crown which is unguarded on this watch, and if I can just get the camera to focus, features Méraud branding on its surface. And in polished steel, I think this matches the case very nicely, and it provides a contrast to the brushed steel around its surroundings. Now, as you can see, it is also a screw-down crown, and comes out like so, very, very smoothly, in fact, and one has a good grip on it as a result of it being quite large, but it does still sit very flush to the case. And the crown itself provides a 200 metre water resistance, as well as, of course, the screw encased back and the use of a sapphire crystal which is pressed into the front of the watch. But now that I've screwed the crown back in, I'd like to flip the watch over to take a look at the case back, which is very well detailed, and I think demonstrates what this watch is aiming to be very, very well. And as you can see from the reference, or serial number 000, this is a prototype, and so several touches may be made to the watch. But the general form of the case back is very appealing, with this raised style of diver with a spear, in addition to having the text of Swiss movement, stainless steel, 20 bar 200 metres, and sapphire crystal. Now, the bezel itself on the front of this watch perhaps commands the eye very, very well, and that's because it has this narrow, squat, but still in many ways very deep form to it. Because as you can see, it's actually made out of a crystal, in the same way as a dial would be, but it's domed over its centre and has these luminous markings underneath it. And this means that depending upon the version which you get, with the version with the graphite dial sharing the black version of the black model, although with different colour lume, and the blue version with a fully blue bezel, one does get the same design where the form of it is concerned. And it clicks rather well. As you can see, it's a 120 click bezel and lines up very, very well with the individual markers. Now, there is a little bit of black backplay in the bezel, but it appears to be sprung, so if you bounce it back, it does come back and return. So I wouldn't view this as a problem, and as far as I can see, the action is very consistent and extremely clear and accurate in terms of lining up with the hands if you're timing something. And this doesn't feature full graduations to 15, which is usually deemed as a necessity for a professional dive watch, but I feel that's missing the point with this piece, which does have a form which is far more stylistic, as well as being a dive watch, than directly designed to be a professional diver for someone who's going to use it every day as a dive watch. And aside from that black dial, which is, as you can see, glossy in its surface, which is an interesting look and is in fact my favourite of these three, one does also have the graphite version. And this also has a strap which contrasts, because each version has a strap which matches its colour, with this in this more grey, cold tone of sort of taupe brown, whereas one sees a much brighter sort of camel to this. And then, whilst I don't have it here, there is a matching blue strap for the blue version. But the dial of this version doesn't feature any sort of aged luminova. Instead, it uses C3, and this gives a much whiter appearance to it, and does change its appearance in the dark a bit, and I will show you later on in the video. And this does share the bezel, as I said, of the black version, but the dial is also a sunburst effect now, although extremely subtle, keeping this watch a very subtle option for someone who wants something a little bit more discreet than the black version. Now, if I put this model down, one sees the blue version is perhaps the brightest, because one has this blue coloration, blue bezel, C3 luminova, and of course a sunburst dial with that blue coloration. And I think this is a wonderful way of presenting this watch as something a bit different, and I think is a nice touch as a counterpart to the black and grey versions, with something a little bit less formal and less vintage in its styling. And this is matched also by a bracelet, but I will speak about the straps and bracelets later on in the video. Now, in terms of the movements inside these watches, which is something I haven't mentioned, they use a rather alternative choice of Swiss movement. So rather than going to ETA or Sellita for a movement, they've gone to STP. And STP is the movement manufacturer and supplier for the Fossil Group and for Zodiac. And of course, having spoken about Zodiac recently, I've been able to see these movements from a more intimate perspective than I would have been able to say earlier. And they have a few interesting features if I just pick up this black version. Now, obviously, this watch doesn't have an exhibition case back, and so one can't see these movements, but they're very well finished pieces, and STP produce movements on a smaller scale than ETA or Sellita. And in terms of their movement quality, they're certainly very, very reputable, and I think the fact that a number of brands are picking them up as a movement supplier is a good demonstration of just the amount of respect people have for their movements. But in terms of architecture, they follow the same lines as their ETA and Sellita counterparts, and so feature hacking and hand winding as you would expect. But they also feature a longer power reserve of 44 hours instead of what one would normally expect from a Sellita SW200, for instance, which is 38 hours, or 40 hours from an ETA 2824. And if one unscrews the crown, these also have been modified. And this plays a role with the way the crown operates, because as you can see, they wind smoothly, and also they are hacking. But they have modified these movements for these watches to not have a date setting function. And so as a result, one pulls out the crown, at its first position it stops the hands and allows you to set the watch. And this marks a difference between this and simply using an off-the-shelf movement, because they've taken the care to have this change made to the movements themselves in order to not have the additional useless position for the crown where one would normally change the date. And I feel it's this attention to detail which really makes these an interesting option. One also should note there isn't Swiss made on the dial. And of course these are Belgian watches, and I appreciate the fact that despite the fact that these watches have Swiss movements, they haven't branded them as Swiss made, which I think shows a great deal of integrity to their nationality and their nation of origin, but also the fact that they really are being very serious with the way they want to designate these watches, and I do respect that. And I feel all of these features come together to produce a watch which is of incredibly impressive quality. And it's the details which stand out with this watch, such as the clean nature of the dial, the fact that there's a ring of metal between the crystal and the bezel, which gives you that division which allows them to both look all the more effective and have a slightly more old-fashioned style, to those bevels in the case and the choice of movement. And so really for 800 or so pounds, this is an incredible value package as far as these details go. And whilst there certainly are better watches on the market, they cost more than this watch, significantly more. Which means that there's a very select few watches this watch is able to compete with, such as the likes of watches from Squale or indeed Zodiac, which I spoke about recently, which are watches which operate in a very similar sort of price range and offer a product which is comparable in terms of its features and its details. But one also sees the straps on these watches, which do present a great deal of value. And as you can see, this watch comes on a rather attractive style of grained leather strap. One also has the same matching buckle as seen on the rubber strap, but the detailing on this is excellent, where one has saddle stitching in addition to a very smooth, soft backing, which makes these a real pleasure to wear. One should also note the bracelet, which is currently not the final bracelet that will be used, because this is a CNC machined one, specifically for these prototypes. But this does demonstrate what the brand is trying to achieve, with these rivets placed into the side of the bracelet itself to demonstrate the appearance of older bracelets, which had these bolt-on sides which would hold the folded links together. And the clasp itself is also very simple, and I think matches the vintage style rather well of these watches. And the clasp itself is very minimalistic. As you can see, it's a folded old style of clasp, which in many ways does follow the same line as these links, which are solid though. And whilst I think that perhaps many people will not take so well to the clasp because it is a very simple design, I do respect the fact that they've tried to create something really true to the original pieces, especially with this very large array of micro-adjustment holes, which was something which was seen on watches of the era. And I think I should show you the way this watch wears on the wrist, because I think that says a great deal about the way this watch is designed. Now, my wrist is just under 7 inches in circumference, and as a result it's perhaps slightly on the larger side for wrists, because one does hear about people usually having a wrist of about 6.5 to 6 3/4 inches. But even so, one can see the fact the watch wears very well with its 39mm diameter. And whilst 48.5mm is relatively long for a lug-to-lug length for a watch of this size, it's very well played off by the fact that they are curved, and the fact that the case back itself, if I just lift it somewhat, is quite shallow. And this means the watch itself can sit very comfortably on the wrist and can be very stable when one turns the bezel without the whole case wobbling around, which can be the danger with a tall and very finely toothed bezel which requires a good grip to turn. Mind you though, the bezel is easy to turn given that and clicks very smoothly, but I feel it is a testament to this watch that it remains stable on a relatively lightweight tapered style of 20mm strap, despite being a watch which is a watch with a longer lug-to-lug length. But certainly it's worth saying that these do fit very well and very comfortably for long periods as well, because the strap supports the weight very effectively. Now here are the watches in the dark, and I feel it's important to show you this because it's an element of the watch which I was very impressed by and which I didn't expect to see. Now, usually with watches with aged lume and indeed a design which is far more in keeping with design than with functionality, one doesn't expect to see extremely high nighttime legibility. However, this really isn't the case with these models. As you can see on the right-hand side, and perhaps as it isn't so obvious in the dark, one has the version in black with the aged lume, whilst on the left I have the grey version, which has exactly the same lume treatment and type as the blue model, so it'll apply for both. And as you can see, there is a slight brightness difference between the aged lume and the standard style of unaged lume, but having tested these watches for a while, the longevity is exactly the same, and so actually they function almost identically. There's also very, very little difference in colour, with a slight yellowness, which is, I suppose, to be expected to the aged lume, whilst the green of the C3 lume on the left is more bold, I think. But either way, you do get extremely high nighttime legibility, and I think these watches would work extremely well as proper dive watches, as a result of the fact that this lume is so good. Also, one can tell the certain elements of the dial apart very well as a result of the 12 o'clock marker being that Arabic numeral instead of having the triangle. And so one has a very, very effective watch at night, which I think really does justify this watch as being much more than a simple dress diver, but instead is a real professional item if you want it to be. And so with the grey version on my wrist, I think it's worth talking about how all of these features come together. Because it's really very, very rare to find a watch offering this sort of value at the price of £800. Now, of course, this price is an impressive one, certainly, but I think impressive because of the features this watch brings together. Because with that domed bezel, the domed crystal, and also with the quality of the dial, which as you can see is very three-dimensional, has very good luminova, and is generally very well detailed, one has a watch which is interesting, and I think that goes an extremely long way, because the quality is certainly there, and so having an interesting watch is something which speaks really volumes for the design of this watch, and the amount of care taken putting it together. And I think it really does live up to its name, which is derived from the word émeraude in French for emerald, for a sort of a jewel, whilst Bonaire is a Caribbean island, in fact, where diving is particularly renowned. And so I think this brings together this idea of a watch used in the 1960s as a sort of a skin diver's watch, a watch with enough water resistance to get you to a significant depth, and design which remains quite minimalistic, quite simple, and in many ways quite slender, quite slim, and very usable on a daily basis. And so I think with this watch you get a really nice balance of style and quality, and certainly the quality is there, with an impressive movement, and of course with a strap which is also very well detailed with that saddle stitching. And so really I've been extremely impressed by these, and it's uncharacteristic for a brand releasing its first model to have got it just so right. And so that really is my conclusion of the video, so do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of these watches, and indeed of my video in general, because I did try to do justice to these pieces as a really impressive new offering on the market. And so if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.